We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it.
The problem with America is not that we go around marauding around the world imposing ourselves. The problem with America in the last 10, 15 years since the end of the Cold War, really in the last 60 years, is that we've been too slow to get involved.
I don't know how many Iraqi civilians were killed, but I can assure you that the number is the absolute minimal that it's possible in modern warfare.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Welcome to the darkened hour.
Welcome to another episode of the Darkened Hour. I'm your host, Adam Fitzgerald. With me today is a special guest. James Corbett is an award-winning investigative journalist who has lectured on geopolitics at the University of Groningen's Studium Generale and delivered presentations on open source journalism at the French Institute for Research in Computer Science and Automatation's FOSSA conference at Tex Groningen and at Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, Japan. He started the Corbett Report website in 2007 as an outlet for independent critical analysis of politics, society, history, and economics. Since then, he has written, recorded, and edited thousands of hours of audio and video media for the website, including a podcast and several regular online video series. His latest series, False Flags, The Secret History of Al-Qaeda, is a three-part docuseries which details the initial and past history of the ultra-Orthodox sect Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. James, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me on, and thank you for talking about this. As I know you know, there aren't nearly enough people out there talking about these aspects of what happened over the past few decades, so I appreciate the work that you do.
No, and you know, as I said before the recording, that it's unfortunate that we don't have more of an in-depth analysis about the geopolitics and the history of Al-Qaeda in a serious setting. And no, the thank you belongs to you for putting out this remarkable, fascinating series, which I'm going to link in the description. But, you know, I'll start off pretty simple, James. What made you do this series to begin with?
I think it was a number of things, and I can't exactly state what was that moment where I decided, all right, I'm going to do this documentary, because as people who have followed my work for many years will know, I've done a lot of work on 9/11 over the years, 9/11 documentaries of various sorts, but it was during actually a rereading of Kevin Fenton's Disconnecting the Dots that it really started to rankle me how little of this information I had ever seen presented anywhere in the alternative media space over the past couple of decades. Identifiable, real, important information that nobody talks about. And that really started to rankle, and it started to get me to think about all of the things that over the past 15 years that I've been researching this, that I've accumulated along the way, that I know all of these different pieces of the puzzle, and the only thing that anyone ever wants to talk about when you say 9/11 is them buildings sure did blow up funny. I think we can do better than that. I think we can go beyond that and actually start to look at some of this history, the geopolitics, the fact that as I forget which 9/11 commissioner it was, but one of them said this was a 20-year conspiracy. Well, I think he was right. In a sense, this wasn't a single day that happened in New York and Washington. This was a confluence of events and factors and characters that populate this vast story that in some senses stretch back centuries, if you really want to go that far, as I do start the documentary there, but really identifiably over the past few decades. And that immense story, there are just so few people out there that are trying to express that I decided I was going to put it together.
And, you know, I share this concern with you regarding the truth movement in regards to staying in one particular area and not expanding upon the other areas, which are much more expansive in nature, but much more self-explanatory, much more detailed as to getting to certain names for certain subjects. I have a problem with this sometimes. I always tell this to people I've invited on the show, and I'll ask you, James. You've been a long time, even further than me, in regards to studying the aspects of September 11, 2001. And I have always come across a very troublesome conundrum in that if I were to reach certain people in the public, where would I start with explaining 9/11? Have you ever come across this problem yourself, and where would you start?
Yeah, it struck me a number of times over the years that I was re-listening to a very, very, very old podcast of mine from 2007 or 2008 recently, and I was actually taken aback by how quickly and authoritatively I summarized what happened on 9/11. And I thought to myself, I couldn't do that today because I know so much more that it's actually difficult for me to say this is what happened in exactly this way and this is what it was. It's the old conundrum: the more you know, the less you actually know, and so I feel the burden of that. So where do you start introducing people to this type of information is incredibly important question, because the obvious answer is, of course, the route that we saw, the 9/11 truth movement, or whatever it calls itself. That's what we saw it take, was the very obvious place to start. Hey, look at these pyrotechnics. That's incredible. Let's spend 21 years talking about nothing else other than this video footage of these pyrotechnics. And we see where that has led, which is to zero justice of any sort for anyone. So I think, hey, maybe instead of banging our head against that brick wall, maybe there's something else useful here. So I have tried to concentrate on other areas. I've done a documentary on 9/11 trillions, about following the money trail of 9/11. I've talked about 9/11 whistleblowers. I've talked about 9/11 suspects. I've done this false flag Al-Qaeda series, which is not a 9/11 documentary, but obviously it features 9/11 as sort of the centerpiece of the documentary. So I've tried to come at this from different angles, if nothing else than to sort of get people thinking about something other than the pyrotechnics of what happened that day.
And I tell you, the series itself was it was fantastic, because it definitely took some time to explain. And there are two people that I consider the ultimate authorities of Al-Qaeda, and that's Ann Sterenson and an author that I just come across, Mustafa Hamid, who wrote the book The Arabs at War in Afghanistan, and what Ann Sterenson's called Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. But besides that, there's very few, authoritative narrative regarding Al-Qaeda itself. So, you start off the series by explaining the long and arduous history of British Empire rule in the Islamic nations, most notably the formation of Saudi Arabia as they helped to capture Najd and Hejaz under Ibn Saud in 1925 with the defeat of the Hashemites. Why was this important to tell the beginning of Al-Qaeda?
I think it's important to set the context of the very idea that not intelligence agencies, I suppose, back in the day, but the precursors to that, at any rate, people in positions in government to be able to wield operatives and under the table transactions and what have you, have for centuries been using Islamic extremism essentially as a geopolitical proxy tool, and a very convenient tool that can be used in both ways, because either you can sort of ally yourself with this group and secretly fund them and help them along so that they can destabilize the government that you don't like in a region, or you can say, hey, look at these Islamic extremists, we have to go in and get them. And in fact, I'm trying to summarize centuries of history here in the first half hour or so of the documentary. It's ridiculous, but I do try to gesture to specific instances of that. For example, the Muslim Brotherhood, which Mark Curtis, in his book, I can't remember the name of the book off the top of my head, but it is linked in the transcript along with everything else I cite. But Mark Curtis's book does a great job of detailing that. For example, the British under the table sort of help for the Muslim Brotherhood at certain stages, and then using them as sort of, well, this is the reason why we have to be in Egypt and things like this. So playing both sides of the table, this is a great game, essentially, that has been played for many, many centuries. And so we have to understand the American empire, Pax Americana of the past 70, 80 years, is in some ways not a carbon copy, but at least following some of the templates that were set by the British Empire.
I want to say the book was Secret Affairs.
That sounds exactly right. Yeah.
British's collusion with the Islam. I think it was the name of the book. I think you actually mentioned this in the film too. The United States' first meeting with Ibn Saud on the USS Quincy in 1945 comes at the heel of the oil company Saudi Aramco in 1938. And at the end of World War II, where Saudi Arabia needed a national defense for which they had none, they called upon the United States. Were these some of the reasons, as well as regulating the oil market, for the U.S. to begin the partnership with the Saudi kingdom, for which it had absolutely no type of real hegemony in the region itself, or any type of commonality with a country that's so different in regards to the religious aspect and the political aspect?
Yes, and in fact, if you watch some of the footage that was taken of that initial meeting, it is quite interesting to see essentially this Saudi ruler's first trip ever outside of the boundaries of Saudi Arabia and off of the peninsula, and very interesting to see. And you can hear the stories about his entourage had to slaughter goats freshly every day for him to eat and things like this. I mean, again, yeah, very, very different culture. But why were they coming together? Clearly, there was a geopolitical alliance here of convenience for both sides, and as you say, the American military umbrella and eventual monetary rewards that come along with that was obviously a big part of the carrot there on the Saudi side of the ledger. On the American side, clearly, obviously, oil resources. As I talk about in my World War I documentary, part of what really happened in World War I was the cementing, the solidifying of the idea that the modern army is going to run on oil, and oil resources are the new absolutely must-have essential thing for not just for the economy of a modern nation state, but for the national security of a nation state. So reflecting that geopolitical reality, I think America certainly saw its bread being buttered in Saudi Arabia by forming an alliance, sure, and propping up a ruling family here with a convenient alliance that allowed both sides to take something out of it. And the Americans certainly did benefit from that relationship in a number of different ways. And that morphed, of course, in the 1970s with the start of the petrodollar regime and taking the oil, of course, denominated in dollars, sold in dollars, and then recycled back through the U.S. banking system in order to keep the U.S. dollar as the core of the world reserve monetary system after the delinking of the gold dollar from gold and all of that, the closing of the gold window. So there's a lot of history that's gone under that bridge. And I think that still actually that U.S.-Saudi relationship is still obviously relevant right up to 2022 and what's going on now. And of course, 9/11 continues to be sort of a card that the U.S. could pull out at any time with regards to Saudi Arabia about, hey, we know some things, some interesting things about 9/11 with regards to Saudi Arabia. And when you read between the lines of certain stories that play out, I think you start to see that there's some geopolitical wrangling that goes on with this delicate dance that they're doing.
It's funny. I'd like to follow up on that, if I may. You bring up this dangling of the meat regarding 9/11. I've been reading the Operation Encore files regarding the latest releases, and I'm wondering, is that what you say, part of the dangling of the meat, so to speak?
I think so. I think at any time at which they think that it is important, they could suddenly declassify all of this stuff. They could, and more importantly, actually make some sort of considered push to actually publicize it and allow lawsuits to go ahead and things of that nature. I think that's the sort of Damocles that hangs over the Saudi royal family at this point. And one of the reasons why I think they have not stepped fully away from the U.S. umbrella yet. They have been inching closer towards Russia and China and some of these other states, but they still, I think, have not severed alliance altogether with the United States. And that might be one of the reasons for it, is because the U.S. absolutely could pull that card out when and if they want to.
You know, you took care to mention in the film how Arab nationalism, which was led by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, was seen as a regional threat to the West. Can you explain why the United States was threatened by Arab nationalism?
I think this again goes back to the British Empire template, if you will, for ruling, which was always about divide and rule. And I can't remember off the top of my head which. Let's see if I can find it quickly. One of the old rulers, the British viceroys of India, had specifically said that one of the future threats to British rule in the region could be the forming of, if these people that we're training and we're giving this, you know, Western education and everything, if they start getting Western ideas of nationhood and independence and you know, modern liberalism or whatever you want to call it, well, then they might start applying that and start, you know, demanding their own rule and things like this. This might be the biggest threat to our rule over these people. So we have to keep them essentially divided and conquered and play up religious extremism and play up divides between people. And that's, I think, the threat that pan-Arab nationalism under people like Nasser presented at that time, was this idea that, well, what if this gigantic and incredibly economically influential, because of the geopolitically sensitive resources that we were just talking about, what if these people started nationalizing their resources and putting this into their own countries and trying to build up their own populations and banding together against Western influence? That, I mean, that was clearly a threat. So I think, once again, it's the divide and rule idea. And one way that has always worked to keep populations divided is to gin up religious extremism on multiple sides, and making sure that those groups are at war with each other as much as possible.
Yeah, because you mentioned this in the film, part one, I want to say, where the British had somehow, like I hate to use the term, but worked with the Muslim Brotherhood in regards to upending or fighting against the secular Arab nationalists of the day. But they also, at the same time, under Hassan al-Banna, didn't want any influence of the British in the region as well. But it's almost like
it's a weird game. Why would they support people who were actively against them, but for convenient alliance for a few years, and then to turn their back and stab them in the back on it? And it's a bizarre story. But as I say that, I think that Mark Curtis book really explained it quite well.
Sure, and you know, we saw this in a revisitation in 1979 anyway, and in which I'm going to talk about here, because 1979 was a key year. With the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Grand Mosque seizure in Saudi Arabia, and the Iranian Revolution against the Western-backed Shah, Reza Pahlavi, that you mentioned so brilliantly in the film. This tended to give rise to the Islamic fundamentalists, whose rise began with the Saudi oil boom of the 70s, backed by the Gulf dollar and the Wahhabi ideology of Saudi Arabia, and the end of Arab nationalism. And of course, months later, with the assassination of the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat. From here, we see two main Islamic fundamentalist groups that had been growing in Egypt, and as the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and Gemma Islamiyah. And later on, we saw Al-Qaeda. Both born out of the death throes of Arab nationalism and backed by the Wahhabi ideology, which all began at the precept of U.S. interventionism. Was this the beginning of a new enemy to replace the Cold War enemy in the Soviet Union?
In retrospect, it certainly was. The question is, who knew that at that time?
Yes.
And I'm not sure. I'm not sure that my thesis would be that this was necessarily, that this was all planned out 30 years in advance. I think that the people who are in positions to be able to influence media coverage of things and to gin up a crisis here and there are probably not thinking 30 years ahead. Oh, this group is going to be able to, we're going to be able to use them. But sort of anything that's on the table and in play that's convenient. Okay, well, maybe we can use this group, which might go some ways towards explaining. I mean, for example, again, if if 9/11 was a completely 100% synthetic event and Osama bin Laden is a character, you know, with wearing a fake beard and it's not real or nothing is real, then why wouldn't they have just synthetically created Iraqi hijackers and given them Iraqi passports so that they could just go directly to Saddam Hussein? Why do this circuitous thing? Again, it's the most plausible explanation is that this group existed. These people were part of what they believed to be this plot, and that plot got hijacked, to use that word. And essentially certain doors opened at certain times, and if you're in that plot and going forward and you're doing it because you believe that I'm doing it for this purpose, and you happen to get through this border, or this thing happens to go right for you, are you going to stop and question it, or are you just going to go with it? Hey, good, we're succeeding. All it takes is the right people in the right positions at the right time to open the right door, and a plot can go ahead and end up developing into something else. So that's the way I look at things like this, like the creation of Egyptian Islamic Jihad and groups like this. Again, I don't think necessarily this was being done puppeteered by some group at the top. It's just that, hey, this is a convenient vehicle through which perhaps we can fit this particular foreign policy agenda.
Right. This is something that I tend to believe is that you have groups like this that are willing to do the dirty work. And all you have to do is make sure that the dirty work is successful, and you get the benefits of the dirty work. That's something that I've always believed. And in regard, by the way, you brought up an interesting point about why not just make it a whole synthetic event. There's one part of 9/11 I like to revisit, get your thoughts. One fringe conspiracy is that the passport that was found in New York that belonged to Saddam al-Saskami, and people say, well, they just planted that passport. And I said, well, why didn't they make it an Iraqi passport? Why didn't they make him an Iraqi? Because you tried to tie 9/11 with Iraq. And I always get this very vague response or something like that.
Yeah, but here's the real trivia on that. Who found the passport? Well, who was it given to immediately, I should say.
Now, this is something that's like, it depends on what source you go by. Now, if I go by Paul Thompson's timeline, it was actually a citizen that gave it to a cop and then gave it to the FBI.
And which particular NYPD intercepted it? If I remember correctly, at least one of the reports, it was Bernard Carrick, right? Who trained? I'm
not sure. Was it?
Yeah, I believe that's the story. I'm going to have to look that up again now because I had the sourcing on this 10 years ago, but it's been years since I looked at it. But
when you're in this,
that was just another part of that story that seems very interesting to me.
Yeah, and then you wonder why conspiracies happen, because then you think like, oh, wait a minute, because Bernard Carrick is a shady character to begin with, so less.
Literal convicted criminal, right?
Yeah, sure. But yeah, I mean, right after this, we're introduced to bin Laden and the Maktab al-Khidmat, the Afghan Services Bureau, or the Officers Bureau, where foreign Arabs descended to Pakistan to enter the conflict against the Soviets. And the two people that were primary orchestrators of creating this were Abdullah Azzam and Abdullah Nas, who was an Algerian rebel, who created the idea of the Bureau. Was funded by bin Laden. And later, as you mentioned in the film, bin Laden and Dr. Ahmed al-Zawahiri from the Egyptian Islamic Jihad took over the Bureau and pushed out Azzam. And very few people, and I'm glad you brought this up in the film, very few people realized that al-Zawahiri was the one who was spreading these rumors that Azzam was actually an agent of Israel, an agent for the Pakistani ISI, and just untrustworthy. And Azzam was actually pushed out. Now, along with the millions of dollars spent from the CIA's Operation Cyclone and bin Laden's money from his father construction company, the Saudi bin Laden Group, and the sympathizers from Saudi Arabia, pouring in billions of dollars. And you have these intelligence aspects like from the CIA, British MI6 and ISI and the Mossad from Israel. And you have the Arab training camps like Al-Masada, where we see the beginning core of Al-Qaeda begin here, in which Al-Qaeda, as you mentioned in the film, was called the base. Was this group made as a byproduct from all of that, which I just said, which was basically the CIA, the ISI, and basically created out of this money and all this funding and training of these Arab camps that brought about this coalition of foreign Arabs into this fight against the Soviets as a product of my enemy, and my enemy is my friend, And could they have not seen this problem in the long run by providing arms and training to these jihadists, which waged war against the West many years later?
Right, right. So this is a fundamental thing that we need to strike back against, which is the blowback narrative, which I understand the appeal of that narrative, because it certainly points to the sort of the deeper and darker things that are behind these types of events, but it's just, well, you know, they're making alliances of convenience here and it blows up over there. Who could have known? And that is perhaps persuasive if it happens once or twice. But when it happens over and over and over and over again, every single time throughout history, do you think these people are literally so incompetent that they could never imagine that this might blow back against us one day? I tend to think that that generally speaking, the incompetence theory does not hold much water with me. I guess it depends on which specific event we're looking at. But in this case, clearly, I always forget his name. Why does I always blank on his name? I play him towards the end of part 3. He was the CIA. I think he was the station chief in Kabul in the 80s. That guy, Milt Bearden, being interviewed by Dan Rather, I think on September 12th, 13th, I think it was like midnight. And he's saying, you know, there's all these stories of Osama bin Laden. There's the myth of Osama bin Laden, the great freedom fighter in Afghanistan, but he hardly did any battle at all. You know, that was a myth. There's the story of Osama bin Laden, the CIA agent in Afghanistan, but the CIA had nothing to do with him. And you know what? I could believe that that is true. There are other people who cite different things that say there was direct CIA involvement with bin Laden in the group at that time in the 80s, but I don't think that's even necessarily, that's not necessary to the story in that sense. But it's what happens from that point forward. The clearly, people like Michael Springman talking about the Osama bin Laden's golden boys being shipped back from Afghanistan to New York, you know, rubber stamping the passport here at the Jeddah visa office. It's the group at the Al Faroud Mosque, and you have Ali Mohammed coming in to train them from taking, you know, weekends off from a special warfare center at Fort Bragg to go train these groups, and being written in the 90s even as, oh, there's this CIA officer who's coming to train them, and they're referring to Ali Mohammed as CIA at that point. I mean, it's ridiculous. And so clearly there was use of this group, and I think that also goes into other areas of operation, like what was going on in Bosnia in the 90s, for example. That is something that I personally have not spent a lot of time researching, so I don't get into that. I really should. I think that's a whole area that I think deserves more attention, but I need to find what good sources to cite on that one. But clearly this was a group that was operational, that was being protected, nurtured, fostered, helped along at various places, and then suddenly got out of control. Blowback. Who could have imagined?
Right. You know, you mentioned Ali Mohammed, and he's such a puzzling figure in all of this. And his connection is a much more mysteriously nefarious connection that you brought up in part 2. So we have Ali Mohammed, who's an Egyptian officer who offers himself to the CIA as an asset in Egypt, then comes to the United States and offers himself to be an FBI asset, and then enlists in the U.S. Army at Fort Bragg while swearing loyalty to bin Laden as Zawahiri. And as you have most likely seen, the one video where he's doing this conference with U.S. officers in a room, and he talks about how Islamic fundamentalism, there's no friendship with Israel, and we need to be at war. So you have a triple agent in retrospect right out in the open. And so much is tied along with Muhammad, including Omar Abdul Rahman, the blind sheikh of Gamma Islamiyah, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri from the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, Osama bin Laden, allegedly, and the members of the Al Farouk Mosque and the Masjid al-Salam in New Jersey, who's tied with the blind sheikh. And all of this have their hands in operations in the early 90s, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the 1998 East Africa bombing, and to which Muhammad was actually charged with providing logistical information to bin Laden about it. Today, Muhammad is still in WITSEC, according to Ali Soufan. and seems that we will never know or hear from him ever again. So, James, I'll ask you, who is Ali Muhammad?
Excellent question. My question is, why is that question not asked every single time that Al Qaeda is not talked about? Because I think you're right. Didn't I think Peter Lance called him in Triple Cross the deepest enigma of the Al Qaeda story, or something along those lines. At any rate, I agree. This is absolutely. I don't understand how you can not talk about Ali Muhammad and who this guy was and how he was doing what he did. And even there, you still only hit on the highlights or lowlights of that career. There were still so many other puzzling aspects of this. He at least claimed to be in the same unit of Egyptian army officers who assassinated Sadat. But don't worry, he had an alibi. He was training at Fort Bragg at the time on a officer training program. And then he ends up, as you say, CIA, then gets immediately told to infiltrate this mosque in Germany, immediately says, hey, I'm with the CIA. They're here to infiltrate you. The CIA finds out about this and cut all ties with him, put him on a watch list. And somehow he ends up getting into the United States anyway. And as Peter Lance reports, well, it might have been the State Department rubber stamping that, and it was part of their, helping terrorist program, essentially. Meeting someone on the flight over and ending up marrying her a few weeks later, and living in California, but then going to Fort Bragg because suddenly he's in the U.S. Army now. Why not? And then leaving his post at Fort Bragg, taking leave for a month so he could go fight Russians in Afghanistan. His supervisor writing up to his supervisors about this, saying, what is going on here? This cannot happen. It happened. He came back with the Special Forces belt. Yeah, I killed Russians, but nothing ever happened of it. Okay, all right. Honorably discharged. Becomes an FBI informant, helping Osama bin Laden move, training his personal bodyguards, all of this. I mean, just insanity. And then, as you say, disappears into a black hole seemingly forever. Never sentenced? Question mark? Maybe? I don't know. Do you know? It was as I released part 1 of this back last year, someone did send me an update, and I have to dig that up. There was some document filed in court with regards to Ali Muhammad. Of course, it's all censored and classified, so you can't see what it is, but some sort of change occurred in his case last year. But what does that mean? Who knows? Still, prisoner number? Any way of finding him or identifying him? Nope. Ali Soufan says he's talked to him. Jack Clunan said he's talked to him. And there was a special forces in the U.S. military who said he talked to him when they were going into Afghanistan. And he said, Ali Muhammad was giving him all this incredibly great detailed info about how they can go and start tracking down Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan.
I've heard this before, right?
Yeah, I forget the guy's name, Blabber or something like that. But those are the only accounts we've ever had of Ali Muhammad in the past 25 years, essentially.
And like I said, so much has originated from him. And just to go back a little bit, you talked about this in the film, in which the initial epoch of New York City's history with Arab fundamentalism starts with the assassination of Rabbi Meir Kahane in 1990 by El Said Nosser, who was a radical fundamentalist from the Al Farouk Mosque in Brooklyn that was led by the blind Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman. Now, although certain historians claim this was an Al-Qaeda connection, none of the members who were involved with the killing of Kahane, including the bombing of the World Trade Center in 93, or those who were involved with the Landmarks plot, which was a follow-up to 93 bombing, were ever part of bin Laden's organization. They never swore bayat, which is loyalty to bin Laden. So, James, I would ask you, who were these people?
Well, I mean, here's one thing. Again, as I try to stress in the documentary, the idea that Al-Qaeda is a singular and coherent organization and you're a card-carrying member or you're not is, again, a bit cartoonish. Yes, there is the bayat, the swearing of allegiance to Osama bin Laden to become part of Al-Qaeda, but there are terrorist groups of various sorts popping up all over the place that will work with each other and collaborate on various things. And again, as with intelligence agencies or essentially any other line of work, it's who you know more so than what organization you belong to in quotation marks, right? So, but as I think you intimate there, what is the common thread there? Well, Ali Mohammed is one of the common threads, because yeah, he's with Zawahiri, he's with Bin Laden, he's with the at the Calverton shooting range, helping to train these guys who end up going on to 93 and the landmarks plot and all of this. So there is some kind of common thread there, and I don't see any way of looking at the Ali Mohammed story that doesn't point to direct complicity of intelligence agencies in what he was doing. There's no way you're going to tell me that they didn't rubber stamp and guide and shepherd him along and allow him to do what he was doing. And maybe there's some explanation for it, 18 layers deep of, oh, well, they were keeping an eye on him so that they knew what was going on or whatever. I'm sure that's what, if it ever came out, that's what they would eventually talk about. But at any rate, they don't even mention that much. No, it was just this Al-Qaeda guy who was really good at infiltrating us. So, who could have imagined? But he seems to be the connecting thread between those groups, which, as you say, are not, this isn't Al-Qaeda, right? But who's Ali Mohammed then?
Yeah, there's so much in regards to, the mysterious nature of some of these people that just basically tend to have like a very vague background, or they just tend to disappear off the face of the earth, or they're locked away for 200 years.
Ramzi Youssef.
Right.
Ramzi Youssef, another big, gigantic question mark. Where was he born? So his mother was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's sister? Really? Yep. Do we know that? How do we know that? Where does that information source from? And then KSM's torture testimony to the 9/11 Commission report, and that becomes that's it. Hey, look, 25% of the footnotes in the 9/11 Commission report derive from torture. Not only sort of secondhand passive derived from torture, but the 9/11 Commission then asked questions to the CIA to get from these people, who then went in and tortured them some more to get the information that the 9/11 Commission asked for. Literally, they tortured people for that report, but we're supposed to take that at face value. So characters like that, KSM, Ramzi Youssef, I know there's a lot written about them, and there's this and that and this document and this connection, but I don't think we have the full picture of who these characters really are.
No, and we don't. I like to get a follow-up to that too. It just seems that with the CIA torturing these people, even if they told the truth, you still couldn't trust it because they were tortured anyway. Do you think that's the reason why they didn't to begin with, so that we can always never know for sure whether it was true or not?
That's actually an excellent point. Because yeah, exactly right. Once you torture someone, it doesn't matter what they're saying, whether it's truth or falsity. We cannot take it at face value. It puts the big question mark over exactly what they've said. So exactly right. All I know is I'm not going to take torture testimony at face value.
No, right.
So so all of that we kind of have to discard. And well, what can we prove from other information and other sources? And what can we verify and triangulate with other information? So it puts us back to square one, or even before square one.
Yeah, this is the whole problem of 9/11 itself, is right. It's just so much vague information out there. And plus, like I always said, there's a war on two fronts. There's a war for information by the federal government and a war of disinformation from fringe theorists. And so you're battling on two fronts. And it's just, some people just throw their hands up and just give up. But going back to Ali Mohammed, with him training bin Laden's network in the Sudan in 92, as you mentioned in the film, the intelligence service mostly, and we talked about this before we recorded, most notably the NSA and CIA began monitoring bin Laden in the Sudan. And this is where later on the NSA learned of a number that bin Laden kept in contact with, and they located it to a house in Yemen, the capital of Sana'a, owned by an associate of bin Laden, Ahmed al-Hada, who would become known as, the house would become known as the Al-Qaeda Communications Hub. Now, right around the same time in 1996, meanwhile, the CIA is building Alex Station, which is the global hub of dedicating tracking bin Laden's network. You also have the Defense Intelligence Agency operation Able Danger, constructed in 96. And it just seems that in the early mid-90s, that the CIA and the NSA had amassed an enormous amount of data regarding bin Laden and Al-Qaeda many years prior to 9/11, but never responsibly act on that information for whatever one reason to another. And, I would just like to pick your brain here as to speculate as to why do you think certain aspects like 98 bombing of the embassies, or the cold bombing of 2000, what are they talking about on these phones?
Yeah. Well, we'll never know, will we? Or
Right.
at least not for many, many years, right? This is the point. And this, for example, read Duffy and Novoselsky's Why the Watchdogs Didn't Bark.
Oh, yeah, that's a great book.
Great book. And it has, I think it's Drake's story about the little dossier of what the NSA knew and what they had, that he had in his hands the days after, and was going to his supervisor trying to say, hey, look, we knew all of this, that we have all of this information. And she says, I wish you hadn't shown me that, or something along those lines. Also talking openly to a bunch of NSA agents, saying this was a gift to the NSA, 9/11, that is. So yeah, again, a huge glaring error in any universe resembling one in which justice would occur. That would be the first thing we would be asking. Okay, so you were listening to their phone calls demonstrably. This isn't conspiracy theorizing. You admit you were listening to their phone calls for 5 years. What did you hear? Can we find out about that? That might seem to be an important part of this story, but again, it's one that's been sealed up under so much secrecy and classification that I very much doubt that we will ever see that in our lifetime.
Yeah, because it's a make or break case for 9/11 itself. And like I said before with you before we recorded, that if they were talking about 9/11 on those phones and they failed to stop it, well then still, I mean, that's a blame. But if they weren't talking about 9/11, maybe they weren't really behind it, and then we got to start asking questions. But and then this should, by the way, this should be, in my opinion, I know how you feel, that this should be the forefront of the 9/11 truth movement, and that they completely have absconded this for.
Yeah, I see what you mean about fighting the dual front war, against mis and disinformation, because yes, it's something that I've been at pains to, I always try to do, or usually try to do in my work, which is to hew to the official documents and the things that we already know and the things that are openly admitted and not contested, and show from within that framework why it cannot be what they're saying. And I know there are people who just cannot comprehend that. Well, you're just believing everything they say. No, I'm not actually believing everything they say, but I am saying that even if we do take at face value what they're saying, they are lying to you. They're covering up something. And those, the intercepts from 96 onward, or was it 92 onward, whatever, absolutely. They either show that yes, there was a plot forming and they were listening to it and they knew all about it and it happened anyway, not just 9/11, but the embassy bombings, other things that, again, we know they were listening to these people. They had taps on every one of, I forget which embassy plotter it was, but he had like 5 different phones. They had taps on every one of them. They were listening to everything he said, but somehow it happened anyway. Oh, well. So again, yes, things like this that we don't have to go on any speculative limb. They say this, and so they have this gigantic hole in their story. Why aren't we talking about that gigantic hole in their story that shows that they are lying and covering things up?
You talked about the bombing of the embassies in Nairobi and Tanzania, and that bin Laden's network was initially blamed for the attacks in the follow-up to his second fatwa and the interview, that infamous interview with John Miller. Some months later, after the interview, the embassies are bombed. However, there were many prior intelligence warnings regarding an upcoming attack, including a reputable member of the cell who was warned of an operation to bomb a U.S. embassy, and the CIA actually interviews him and deports him. And also we have the Sudanese U.S. ambassador and Prudence Bushnell. You talked about in the film about how she warned about certain security lapses and basically went ignored. And this is similar to what we see with the U.S.'s cold bombing that you mentioned in the film in the year 2000, where a DI operation called Able Danger. I've interviewed 2 of those people, Anthony Schaefer and Rick Kleinsmith, where they warned of an Al-Qaeda attack, which could have thwarted the attack to begin with. All these warnings went ignored. And it's almost like I'm preaching to the choir with you, James, because you obviously you mentioned this in the film, but you've been saying this for years. When you said before, if it happens once, we can understand. But if it's a repetitious incident, well, then we got to start questioning whether they're allowing this to happen or we have a bunch of incompetent people in intelligence.
Yeah, and this is, this is another part of that two-front war, I think, which is that one of the things that became a big divide and rule of 9/11 truth, or again, such a contentious term, but whatever you call it, a decade and a half ago, 2 decades ago, was lie hop versus my hop. You know, which side are you on? Is it let it happen on purpose or make it happen? Or you think it was let on happen on purpose and you're a shill and I won't ever talk to you, blah, blah, blah. Which is, of course, nonsense. Because in a sense, lie hop, even if they just sat there and just watched it, everything that was happening, and then just let it happen, that is making it happen. There is no distinct difference there. That is what is happening when you let something like this occur. So again, I'll go back to what Bearden said, and I have that quote from him at the end of the documentary where he said, if Osama bin Laden didn't exist, they would have had to invent him. Because exactly right, this is a perfect proxy. And they, of course, it's this third-party group that's doing all this stuff. And there was a warning, but we missed it. Incompetence. Oh well. We were listening to their phone calls, but I guess we weren't listening that closely. Oh well. All of these things, they can just go, incompetence, and kind of wave their hands. And most people won't even think to look that far into the story. But if they do, incompetence, blowback, whatever. I don't want to be a crazy conspiracy theorist. I won't accuse them of letting anything happen on purpose, let alone making it happen on purpose.
Let's fast forward to 9/11, because it seems that right as soon as it happened, the media attention, right in the passing hours, and I remember this because I was in New York when it happened, and the focus was on Osama bin Laden right away. Even though his statements over the years were about attacking the United States, and that you had multiple intelligence cables and warnings of bin Laden wanting to attack the United States. That's not the conspiracy. The conspiracy is, how would they have known that bin Laden was behind it before they even did an investigation? Because it seemed like the media was rushing to blame somebody. And you mentioned this as an important part of part 3 of your series, is that they took, it's almost like they wanted to blame somebody right off the bat before they even did an investigation. And like I said, it's not a conspiracy to blame bin Laden, even though he wanted to attack the United States. But to rushingly blame him, I thought was basically a rush to judgment and a rush to blame somebody. And, you also mentioned in part 3 too, that it was the Taliban that actually went before the media committee and basically said that they would offer bin Laden to Bush if they just brought evidence of his complicity in the attacks. And Bush's response was, we don't deal with terrorists. Well, that seemed very convenient.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, at first, they were saying, okay, we'll send him to some third party country. He has to be tried in some sort of Islamic court, because we can't give him, that would totally, and that was rejected. But then they said, okay, no conditions, we'll give him to you, whatever you want. Nope, too bad. We don't negotiate with terrorists. Exactly right. So again, convenience. Yes, the headlong rush to blame Osama bin Laden and to, again, as I demonstrated in the documentary, that very day, numerous sources, not just media speculation, but people, we're hearing it from FBI, they're looking at Osama bin Laden on the very day, let alone within the coming days, within the coming weeks. And then when pressure started to mount, well, why don't you show us something? Again, they hand it off to a third party. Oh, Tony Blair, or the UK government, they've got a dossier coming out. It'll explain it all, guys. And then when you actually read the document, it is lunacy that would have convinced anyone of anything. And even more importantly, the Frank Taylor classified briefing that he gave to the Atlantic Council in October of 2001, which eventually became the rubber stamping of the invasion of Afghanistan, the legal framework for the NATO invasion, was given. It was eventually, that document essentially was leaked on IntelWire in 2009. No one noticed it at the time. No one recognized what it was, but it was that cable that was sent to all the State Department offices around the world on the same day or the day before of the Taylor briefing. And when you read through it again, it flabbergasted me, because when that was, I was in Denmark giving a talk, and Niels Herrick came up to me and said, have you read this? Do you know what this is? This is the Frank Taylor report. And I knew of Frank Taylor and the classified briefing because I'd covered that before, but I was like, oh, that's classified. We don't know about it. He's like, no, this is it. And he put it in my hands, and I read it front to back. And I was like, okay, we're going to get something. We're going to get something here. There's going to be something. And they go through history of Al-Qaeda and history of terrorist operations and history of this and history of that. And then they get to 9/11 and say, essentially, well, it was a plot that was done in secret that was intended to harm many people. So it was Al-Qaeda. Like, that is the sum total of their evidence. I really implore people to read that document for themselves to really see this is it. This is what they based their determination on right away, or at least what they were briefing people about in friendly governments around the world to get them on board with the war of terror. It's absolutely a sickening crime, especially when you think about the millions of lives that have been affected by those lies in those days that steamrolled into the war of terror. This should be the biggest thing that everyone is concerned about. And yet, when I put together a documentary like this, the most common question is, why are you talking about this now?
To me, the most important part of the film is what we see as the ripple effect of September 11th, 2001. We see the influence of the White House, led by the neocon faction of Richard Pearl and Douglas Feith and the Office of Special Plans, as well as the Project for New American Century, which pressured the intelligence services to find a connection between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. This seemed to be a plan to destabilize the Islamic countries outside of the Gulf, which would primarily benefit the military-industrial complex, Israel, and the Saudis, the Gulf. Would this be an agreeable conspiracy theory? No, it's not much of a conspiracy because it's a matter of fact as to these foreign policy guidelines like the Oded Yunan Plan or the Paul Wolfowitz Doctrine or the Project for New American Century or the Bush Doctrine. All of these, it didn't come 100% to fruition, but most of it all came to fruition on the basis of the ripple effects of September 11, 2001.
Absolutely, and demonstrably so. And again, I know it's been cited a million times. Let's cite it 1,000,001. The Project for New American Centuries, Rebuilding America's Defenses document, talking about the new Pearl Harbor, catalyzing catastrophic event like a new Pearl Harbor. But it wasn't just that document. Rumsfeld, in his swearing-in hearings or his interview when he was being sworn in to be defense minister, talking about, I was just reading about Pearl Harbor and the way that America was caught off guard and what that would be like. And Pearl Harbor was being brought up over and over and over and over. The American psyche was definitely prepared for a new Pearl Harbor around September of 2001. And then everything that they'd been talking about and writing about for years in the case of things like the Clean Break document, decades in the case of Oded Yunon, suddenly coming to fruition. As you say, here it is. Yeah, they're going to do everything that they were saying they were going to do. The only thing that's surprising is that the 7 countries in 5 years list, well, they didn't get to those 7 countries in those 5 years, but well, a number of them certainly did end up in the crosshairs. But here's again, that's so obvious that if people cannot see that by this point in 2022, I would say they're probably hopeless. I would say just get caught up to speed in what has occurred. But here's, in a sense, perhaps the more interesting and kind of bigger question here with regards to that, because again, we can look at this and see how it would benefit these various players. Obviously, the military-industrial complex, obviously, but things like Israel. Okay, so they want to destabilize, they want to get rid of Saddam Hussein as a way of destabilizing an ally of Bashar al-Assad so that they can get rid of the Assad government in Syria. These dominoes were put in place a long time ago, and then they start to fall. But when they start to fall, what happens? You get rid of Hussein, and suddenly you have the Sunni groups in Iran, in Iraq, which is, of course, the majority of the population, start to gain the majority political power and start to have political influence. And suddenly Iran has more influence in Iraq than it ever did before. And instead of keeping those two countries apart and at war with each other, as they were obviously for a very long time, suddenly now it's like Iran has influence in Iraq, and there are Iranian groups that are working there it's a bigger threat than it was before. So was that part of the plan? And if it was, then why? But if it wasn't, then are these planners incompetent? Did they not understand this was how it was going to work? And then you have to start asking questions about what happened in Iraq during the invasion and occupation, the bombing of the Golden Mosque and other very strange incidents, the prison break. Oh God, I can't remember was it Basra? At any rate, where you had the British SAS troops dressed up as Muslims that were caught, taken to prison, and they end up busting down the prison with tanks and freeing all the prisoners, including the British SAS troops. Again, there's a lot of stories like that of maybe they were ginning things up there, but then again, why? And how did this play into hands. And then it leads to the creation of ISIS, which again, the DIA, once again, 100%, they said it's coming. They're going to start an Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And then it came. Yeah, exactly. And they watched as the convoy streamed across. They could have bombed it. They didn't. This happened many, many times. And so again, is this part of the bigger conspiracy, or is this incompetence? There's a lot of questions to do with that. But again, I think this is something that people kind of miss this forest for the trees of the individual events.
Yeah, for sure. And also, I was quite exhilarated. You brought up one conspiracy regarding Bin Laden, because this is so often confused with so many fringe elements that you brought some sanity into it. And there's very few people I can actually name. Der Spiegel, the German article, is one. My co-researcher 9/11, Nelson Martin's DJ Thermodetta, is the only one. And yourself, now I can say that regarding Bin Laden and the Afghan Bin Laden confession tape, which was found on December 13, 2001, in which you basically brought up the German Gernot Rotter, who basically pointed out that, no, the tape is not fake, but instead that they missed the translations were not right. And when I read that on Der Spiegel many years ago, I think it was Der Spiegel, or was it from Rotter? I'm not sure. But when I saw it in your film, I was like, that's right. I remember this conspiracy about it.
Yeah, because it was the fat Bin Laden video, right? That's not Bin Laden. Look how fat he is. And people are looking at one grainy clip from one section of it. It was a PAL to NTSC conversion, which kind of takes the image and goes, well, and when you put the back in the proper perspective, it's Bin Laden. And especially if you actually watch the whole video, which I did, and I know I had the full hour tape at some point. It was online, I had it, and I cannot find it on my hard drives anymore, and it's extremely hard to find the full thing anymore.
I have it, so I could give it to you.
Please do. Or better yet, put it up on your channel. Put it up on Odyssey or somewhere where it's not going to be taken down, and I will definitely let people know about that, because that is an important artifact. Because once you watch it and you see him walk in the room, it's a 6'4" lanky. Right. I mean, it's Osama bin Laden. There's no doubt about it. And I talked to I have an interview from 2009 or something like that of one of the people who wrote an article, I think for Muckraker Report at that time, about this. Yeah, it was a PAL to NTSC conversion thing. It's not Fat Bin Laden. But yeah, the real meat and potatoes is, okay, so what did he say? And again, I don't speak Arabic. I don't know. I can't tell. But you have people saying the Pentagon translation is wrong. And you have the White House spokesman at the time in the documentary. I played the clip of him saying, people are saying it's not an exact translation. Anyway, you get the point, essentially is what he's saying. No, we don't get the point, because these words actually make a huge difference. Sure. Calculated in advance. If he didn't say those words, then that is a conspiracy that they inserted that type of language into this confession document. And then there's the whole thing about the tape itself, and it's cut with the footage of the helicopter, the crashed helicopter, and the way that it's cut, it's reverse chronological, so that probably happened first, and then you're trying to figure out, okay, so when did this meeting actually take place, and who was there, and then how did they really get it? Because of course the official story is the Afghan the anti-Taliban forces in Afghanistan.
Northern Alliance,
right, exactly, Northern Alliance. Once they took over Kandahar, right? It was where they found it. They found it in a house raid. Like, oh, here's a tape. Oh, what's this? Oh, wow, it's an Osama bin Laden confession. Again, that's another story that being me, I don't take at face value.
Right. So, James, what do you want to get from this documentary, this 3-part documentary? What do you hope for? What are your goals of trying to reach? Are you trying to reach a specific audience? Or are you trying to reach a broader audience? Are you trying to persuade people from the fringe elements of the truth movement to come back into the reality and say, hey, these are rational questions that we're asking, and that we need to get back on track on the more important issues regarding 9/11 and pre-9/11?
In a sense, maybe all of those things to certain degrees, although I think what I try to do is put my work out there. This is what I know. This is what I've put together. These are my sources. And this documentary, like everything I do, the full hyperlink transcript is there, 50,000 plus words. All of the video, all the audio, everything is there for your download for free. I'm putting it out there so that, hey, this is what I know about this. And I don't know everything. I know that I do not know everything about this story, but this is what I've got. And to put the conversation out there for people who want to have it, and let the chips fall where they may. I can't, what am I going to do? I can't shake people by the lapels and tell them, hey, I think this is important, but I can put out there what I think is important and let people come to their own conclusions about it. And so that's what I'm doing. And why, again, the question, okay, yeah, but it's 2022. Why now? I guess partly it is honestly from a sense, we still need justice for this. And again, not just for 9/11, which obviously was a huge crime that took place that still, I think the perpetrators have not been brought to justice for it. But I hesitate to say more importantly, as you say, the ripple effects of what came from that event and what were justified on the back of that event. The war of terror is an ongoing, but certainly for the past couple of decades, a horrible, terrible crime that has been committed. And it has cost millions of lives. That is a huge thing that we cannot just say, oh, that was a decade ago. Stop living in the past, man. No, I think we still do need to know about that. We also, I think, need to take a look at these types of operations, these types of manipulations, these deceptions. How do they occur? The better that we understand things like that, the less effective they will be on us in the future, because these types of operations continue to be ongoing. I think they just take different forms in different eras, and it might not be the terror boogeyman at this moment, although that's always a card up the sleeve. As long as the 9/11 myths and the Al-Qaeda myths, as long as they stand, it's always a card that they could pull out at any time. Wow, look at this reformed Al-Qaeda, resurgent Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and now they have bioweapons, and they're unleashing the new plague, or whatever comes next. I think we have to understand that history in order to diffuse it, disarm it, break that magic wand that they use to wave in front of the public and try to get them to go along with their agendas.
What projects do you have in the future? And if any, what are you doing now as your next venture?
Well, as I mentioned, I did do a World War I documentary a couple of years ago. And speaking of, why are you doing this now? Well, on the 100th anniversary of the armistice, I released my World War I conspiracy documentary. It's at corbettreport.com/WWI. And that was a similarly, I think, well, not as big as my False Flags documentary. That's a 5+ hour documentary. It's by far the biggest thing I've ever done. But it was a couple of hours altogether. And it ended with a to be continued ... So I will be continuing that series, obviously, from that point in 1918, an armistice, but the story continues. It's a grander geopolitical story. And perhaps, I guess, False Flags kind of, as we get further and further into that story, it does play a part in it. Obviously, the geopolitical wrangling of the past couple of decades has been dominated by that war of terror myth, which plays an important part of it. But I'm looking specifically at the geopolitical relations, the formation of Pax Americana post-World War II, and whatever is coming next post-World War III, ? So that's kind of where I'm trying to redirect my attention now. I'm just trying to recover from finishing False Flags, to be honest, because that was a lot of work.
Yeah, then inexplicably, a lot of detail went into it. But James, it was unfortunate because I know you had such a huge channel on YouTube, and I was very shocked to see it deleted. Where can people find your work now?
The best place to go is corbettreport.com, CORBETT report.com. And from there, you can find, well, I post everything directly to my site, and even the videos themselves you can download directly from my server. So even if I got scrubbed from every social media platform on the planet, it would still be there at corbettreport.com. But from there, you can find links to all of my different social media places that I do post. I tend to use Odyssey the most. I think it's one of the most convenient, but I also post to archive.org. I post to BitChute. I post to Substack now. And I've just started a Rockfin channel and a Rumble channel. I don't necessarily like Rumble. I think that I have misgivings about it as a platform and Peter Thiel's investment in it and what have you. But at any rate, for the time being, I will use it as another outlet. If people are there, I will get the word out to people there. So that's what I'm going to continue doing. Hey, I wasn't on YouTube because I thought it was a great corporation or something. I was on YouTube because that's where I could reach millions of people. And I did. I had 190 million views or something by the time I got scrubbed. So, you know, it's obviously I will probably never have another 1 million+ view documentary. But at least at this point, I know that the people who are there because they're really looking for this information. So I'm going to try to give them the most action-packed and important information that I can.
James Corbett from the Corbett Report. The series is False Flags, The Secret History of Al-Qaeda. Thank you very much for joining us today, James.
Thank you for having me on. I hope we can talk again in the future.
Sure.